The king offered his fortune for her hand. Her father said, "She needs a good man, not a rich one." In the village of Thornmere, where the river ran copper in autumn and the wolf howls carried all the way from the ridge to the valley floor, there was a saying old Aldrich the millwright had stitched into a scrap of canvas and nailed above his workshop door. A coin spends once. A good man spends a lifetime. He had lived by that saying through the death of his mate, through lean winters and flood seasons, through the slow, grinding poverty of a man who owned his skill, but not his land. He had told it to his daughter Senna every morning while she braided her hair, every evening while she banked the fire. She had heard it so many times that she heard it even in silence, in the space between one breath and the next, in the soft turning of the millstone, in the sound of her own heartbeat. She did not know, the autumn she turned 23, that a king was about to make her father prove he meant every word. Chapter 1. The Census of Thornmere. The Alpha King came to Thornmere without banners. That was the first strange thing. Kings sent heralds ahead of themselves like stones thrown before a crossing to test the ice. They arrived in guilt and noise and the nervous laughter of officials. But the man who rode down the valley road on a dark-roan horse at the break of the harvest week wore plain riding leathers and a hood against the dawn chill, and only 2 riders flanked him, close enough to protect, far enough to give the impression of solitude. Senna saw him from the mill roof, where she had gone up before sunrise to check a loose shingle her father's bad knee wouldn't let him reach. She didn't know what she was looking at. Only a rider, broad-shouldered, sitting a horse the way some men sit a throne, as if the animal had chosen him rather than the other way around. There was something in the set of his jaw she could see even from that distance, something that made the wolf sense she didn't have seem to prickle in its absence. She was wolfless, had been all her life. Born to a shifter father and a human mother who had died when Senna was 4, she had grown up in the complicated borderland between species, too human for the pack's comfort, too wolf-born for the village humans to fully claim. She ground their grain and kept her father's books, and was useful in the fine, invisible way that useful things are invisible, which is to say, constantly, and without credit. She came down from the roof before the riders reached the mill road. "Father." She found Aldrich at his workbench, already fitting a new tooth into a gear. 3 riders on the valley road, no livery I recognize. He didn't look up. Census men, maybe. The king sends them every 5 years. Census men don't ride horses like that. Now he looked up. Something passed across his weathered face, a calculation she recognized as the same one he used when inspecting timber. What is this worth? And what will it cost? Then we'll give them clean water and answer their questions honestly, he said. Same as anyone. Chapter 2. Gold on a Rough Table. The Alpha King's name, they learned by afternoon, was Cale Vorn. He had come to Thornmere on what his quiet-voiced steward, a narrow man named Doss who did all the speaking, called a valley audit. The king was personally reviewing the smaller holdings of the Vorn territory, the ones that fell between the census lines, and had been neither taxed fairly nor serviced adequately. There was something almost administrative about the way Doss explained this, as if a king personally riding the back roads of his own kingdom to correct bureaucratic oversight was entirely unremarkable. Senna served them at her father's table. Water, bread, the last of the autumn preserves. She moved around the edges of the room, doing what she always did, filling cups before they emptied, removing plates before they crowded, making space so others could occupy it. The king watched her do this. She noticed him noticing, which was itself unusual, because most people who watched Senna were watching for her to make an error. He had dark eyes, not black, but the particular deep brown of river water where it ran over ironstone. His face was not a handsome face in the courtly sense. It had been broken somewhere along the ridge of the nose and healed slightly crooked, and there was a scar at his left jaw that her eyes kept finding. But it was a present face. Entirely present, in the way of a man who had learned that the world would lie to him, and had decided to look carefully at everything as a result. When the bread was gone, and the water had been refilled twice, Doss cleared his throat. Aldrich Kem of Thornmere Mill. He did not use Senna's name. "The king has a proposal to put to your household." Her father set down his cup. "The proposal concerns your daughter." Doss placed a leather pouch on the table. It landed with the dense, heavy sound of serious money. "The king offers this as a first installment toward a formal suit. The total sum, across 4 installments, would be sufficient to purchase this mill outright, clear any outstanding debts across the valley, and establish a household endowment." "No." Doss blinked. Even Senna went still. Her father's voice had been entirely calm. Not offended, not flustered. Just the single syllable, clean as a tool set down. "Aldrich," Doss began, "my daughter is not a transaction." Aldrich pushed the leather pouch back to the center of the table with one blunt finger. He looked at the king directly. Something that took, Senna knew, a specific kind of courage. "She needs a good man, not a rich one." The room was very quiet. Outside, the millstone turned in the current, its low, grinding voice like a slow pulse. Cale Vorn had not moved. He looked at the leather pouch. He looked at Aldrich, and then he looked at Senna, who had gone perfectly still near the window with a water jug in her hands, and an expression she hoped communicated nothing at all. "Your father is remarkable," he said. It was the first time he had spoken directly, and his voice was lower than she'd expected, with a roughness to it like the first word said after a long silence. Most men would have taken the first number. "My father," Senna said carefully, "means what he says." "I can see that." The king rose. He was taller than she'd registered at the table. "Then I won't insult him with money again." He walked to the door, paused, and turned back. He looked at Senna with that careful, river-dark attention. "But I'll come back," he said. "If I may." Aldrich considered this for a long moment that Senna spent not breathing. "You may," her father said, "if you come as a man." Chapter 3. The Return of Cale Vorn. He came back 4 days later. Alone. No Doss. No steward's leather satchel. No official purpose dressed in polite language. He arrived at the hour when Senna was tallying the week's grinding ledger, bags in, flour out, debts carried forward in her careful columns. And he stood in the mill doorway in ordinary clothes and said nothing for a moment, just watched her work the way she had watched him that first morning from the roof. "I don't know how to do this," he said. Senna looked up from her ledger. "Do what?" "Talk to someone who isn't talking back at a king." He moved inside out of the doorway and looked at the millstone, the grain chute, the dust hanging gold in the morning light. "Everyone I speak to is speaking to a crown. It's a particular kind of loneliness." She thought about that. She was well acquainted with particular kinds of loneliness. "I'm good with ledgers," she said finally. "Numbers don't care what title you hold." He laughed, short, surprised, genuine. It changed his face in a way the careful expression hadn't. She showed him the mill's accounting that afternoon, not because it was romantic, but because it was what she had, and because it seemed important to meet him in her real life, rather than some imagined version of it. He asked questions that were not foolish. He understood basic trade mathematics, which she had not expected, and when she explained the flooding pattern that cut Thornmere's grinding season short each spring, he didn't offer to throw money at it. He pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the pattern herself across 5 years of her neat columns. "There's a water management project in the Eastern Valley that dealt with the same problem," he said. "I could send you the engineer's notes." "I'd read them," she said, which was not the same as thank you, but was more honest. He came back the day after, and the day after that. Chapter 4. What the village said. Thornmere had opinions. By the end of the first week, the mill's visitors had been observed, counted, and debated at the bread baker, the dye house, and the edge of the harvest field where the valley's women gathered at midday. The general assessment was as follows. Senna Kem, the wolfless miller's daughter who was competent and quiet, and not quite belonging to either of the village's species, had somehow attracted a king, and nobody could agree on what it meant. "She's not even shifted," said a woman named Tulla, who had a second cousin in the pack hierarchy, and enjoyed proximity to authority. What does a king want with a wolf girl who never turned? Maybe he wants someone who won't bite, said old Perith from the bread oven, which made several people laugh in a way Senna, passing the window with a sack of winter rye, heard and filed away without letting land on her face. Her father, when she relayed this later in the careful way she relayed difficult information, as fact, without the sting, looked at her steadily. They're afraid, he said. Of me? Of the idea that worth isn't where they put it. He set down his plane. It disturbs people, Senna, when something they've overlooked turns out to matter. She knew this. She had known it all her life in the low-grade way of knowing a stone in a shoe, constant enough to be background, sharp enough to remind her. What she hadn't known was that knowing it could feel, with her father saying it plainly at the workbench, like something being set down rather than carried. She kept a small copper coin on the windowsill above the ledger desk, not for spending, but because her mother had carried it, and her father had given it to her when she was 7, pressing it into her palm with the words, "She would have seen you clearly, just as I do." It had a woman's profile stamped in it that might have been anyone, and was, in Senna's private understanding, everyone. She moved it that evening to her coat pocket, for no reason she could have named. Chapter 5. The Question of the Wolf. She told Cale about the wolf on the 7th visit. He had earned it, she thought, not with money and not with charm, but with the careful way he had spent those 7 visits asking her questions and listening to the answers. He had asked about the flooding. He had asked about the pack hierarchy and how Thornmere's half-human families navigated it. He had asked once, with some difficulty, whether she was happy here, and when she'd said mostly, he had not tried to fix the mostly. They were walking the river path in the late afternoon, the water copper the way it went in autumn, and she said, "You should know I don't shift." He didn't miss a step. "I know." "Does it—" She stopped. The question she wanted to ask sat in a difficult place, in the part of her that had been told without words for 23 years, that her lack was a flaw requiring management. "Does it matter to you?" He was quiet long enough that she braced herself. Then, "My mate bond was broken 4 years ago. She chose to sever it." His voice carried the particular flatness of a healed wound, not quite scar tissue, not quite tender. "The court decided this was because I was too severe, too occupied with governance, too little present. They may have been right. I spent a year thinking the answer was to find someone who fit a specific shape of what a queen should be. Shifted, ranked, politically useful." He paused at a bend in the river. "I came to Thornmere because the census line had failed its people for 30 years, and nobody had bothered to notice. And I met a woman who keeps her dead mother's coin in her coat pocket, and runs her father's books with more accuracy than my Treasury Department." She had gone very still. "My wolf doesn't care that yours is absent," he said. "It cares that you're honest." She had not cried in front of another person since she was 11 years old, when a pack child had called her hollow, and she had gone home and cried until her father held her and said, "Hollow things don't love like you do." She did not cry now, but something in her chest that had been held at a particular careful tension since childhood released. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like a millstone slowing. A subtle, enormous shift. "I don't know what I am to you yet," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'd like to find out without a transaction involved." She looked at the copper river. "My father would say that's a better start than most." Chapter 6. The Night of the Harvest Feast. The trouble came at the Harvest Feast, which was the thing Thornmere dreaded and needed in equal measure. 3 days of communal celebration that required all its tensions to exist in the same small space. The pack's senior beta, a man named Voren who wore his authority like a garment slightly too large for him, had decided that Cale's presence in Thornmere was a territorial matter, and requested a formal audience at the feast. This was, everyone understood, not a request. Voren had the kind of hierarchical standing that made his invitations feel like subpoenas. Cale attended alone. Senna went because her father was too proud to let his household be represented by an absence, and because she had come to understand over the past week, not willing to be represented by an absence anymore. Voren did not speak to her, He spoke around her, in the particular technique of dismissal that required the dismissed party to be present, but functionally invisible. "The wolfless girl," he said to Kale, somewhere in the middle of his second cup of fermented apple, "is a kindness you're offering a nobody. It will confuse the valley." "Tell me what you mean by confuse," Kale said. His voice was the same low, careful thing it always was, but Senna, standing beside him, felt the quality of the stillness around it change, the way weather changed before a storm. "She has no rank, no wolf, no political weight." Voran spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to be reasonable. "She grinds grain. That's a fine and necessary thing. But a king's consort does what, exactly?" Kale set down his cup. "What does a king's consort need that Sennakem doesn't have?" Voran looked briefly uncertain. Bloodline, shift, pack standing. "She has her father's name, which is worth more in this valley than your rank, because he has spent 40 years doing honest work that kept this community fed." The quiet in Kale's voice was now the quiet of something very large, moving slowly. "She has intelligence, integrity, and the ability to look at a 30-year accounting failure and find every error without being told where to look. She has a father who turned down my fortune because he cared more about her dignity than his comfort." He paused. "What bloodline were you going to offer me that outweighs that?" Voran said nothing. "I thought not." Senna breathed. It was a strange thing to be defended, to stand inside a defense and feel that it was accurate, not inflated, that nothing had been claimed for her that she didn't already hold. She thought of her father's saying. She thought of the coin in her pocket, pressing warm through the fabric. Later, walking home in the dark with the feast light behind them, Kale said, "I'm sorry if that made things harder for you here." "It didn't," she said. "It made them truer." He reached for her hand in the dark. She let him. Chapter 7. Aldrich's Judgment. The last conversation happened at the workbench. Aldrich Kem had watched the king of the Vorn territory come to his mill 11 times in 12 days. He had watched his daughter, who had been careful and contained and quietly extraordinary her entire life, begin to move through the world with a fraction less caution, laugh faster, argue more, hold her opinions up to the light instead of folding them into her chest. He had watched this, and he had said very little, because Aldrich believed in observing before speaking, and speaking before acting, which was a sequence that most of the world had inverted. On the 12th day, Kale Vorn arrived at the mill not to see Senna. She was in the village returning flour sacks, but to speak with Aldrich. "I haven't come to make an offer," Kale said, standing at the workshop door. "I want to ask your opinion." Aldrich put down his plane. "Of what?" "Of me. Whether I'm what she needs." The old millwright considered him for a long time. He looked at the king the way he looked at timber, searching for the grain, for the hidden flaws, for the places where the material would hold and the places where it might split under pressure. "My daughter has been overlooked so long she stopped expecting to be seen," Aldrich said finally. "Anyone can see her now that a king has made it easy. The question is whether you'd have seen her if she'd had nothing remarkable about her at all. If she'd just been the miller's quiet daughter with the careful books and the dead mother's coin." Kale was silent. "Answer carefully," Aldrich said. "She'll know if you're lying. She's always been able to tell." "I came to Thornmere for the census." Kale's voice was measured. "She was on the roof when I rode in, checking a shingle her father's knee wouldn't let him reach. I didn't know whose daughter she was. I didn't know she kept the books, or that she'd spoken up in her father's kitchen while half the court would have stayed silent." He paused. "I just saw someone who was already up before dawn solving a problem nobody had asked her to solve. And I thought, that is a person I would like to know." Aldrich was quiet for a long time. The millstone turned outside. Then he reached up to the wall and took down the scrap of canvas. Old, slightly grimed, the stitched letters still readable, that had hung above his workshop door for 20 years. He handed it to Kale. "A coin spends once," Kale read aloud. "A good man spends a lifetime." "That's the only inheritance I can give her," Aldrich said. "I want to see it in good hands before I'm gone." The king held the canvas for a moment, then folded it carefully and put it in his inner pocket, over his heart. "I'll try to earn it every day," he said. "That's all any of us can do," said Aldrich. And he picked up his plane and went back to work, which was the closest thing to a blessing he had. Chapter 8. What Senna said, she found out that evening. Her father told her plainly, as he told her all things, sitting at the kitchen table with the fire going, and 2 cups of evening tea, as if the information was ordinary, as if kings visited millwrights every day and had their fortunes weighed against canvas scraps of stitched philosophy. "He asked my opinion," Aldrich said. "I gave it." Senna turned her cup in her hands. "And?" "He answered well." "And the canvas?" "Is his now." He looked at her steadily. "You'll want to have your own conversation." She went to find Cale where she half knew he'd be, at the bend in the river path, where they'd talked about the wolf and the broken bond and the 30-year accounting failure. He was standing at the water, not quite waiting, not quite not. She stood beside him. "You took my father's canvas," she said. "He gave it to me." "He doesn't give things away." "No." Cale turned to look at her in the last of the evening light. "He doesn't." She looked at the copper water. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not the performance of it, not the version that required her to be exceptional or remarkable, or the miller's daughter with the lucky Wolf King's attention, but the quiet, daily version. Someone knowing which cup was hers without asking. Someone reading 5 years of flood ledgers because they wanted to understand her problem rather than solve it quickly. Someone telling a room full of people that integrity was a bloodline. "I have my mother's coin," she said. "I've had it since I was 7. My father says she would have seen me clearly." "I believe that." "I don't need you to provide for me," she said. "I know how to provide. I've been doing it since I was 15. I know. And I don't need you to defend me exactly. I can hold my own with Vorin and his kind." "I know that, too." "What I need—" She stopped, found the words, tried again. "What I need is someone who stays present, who doesn't disappear behind a crown or an office, or the business of being powerful, and forget that I'm still here with my flour sacks and my ledger columns." Cale reached into his inner pocket and produced the folded canvas. He held it between them, not offering it, just making it visible. "A good man spends a lifetime," he said. She looked at him, at the crooked nose and the scar at his jaw, and the river-dark eyes that had been careful and present since the first morning he rode down the valley road. She thought of all the ways she had been taught to make herself smaller, quieter, less, and how her father had, his whole life, refused to shrink her in return. "Yes," she said. Not to a proposal exactly, because he hadn't quite made one yet, but to the direction of things, to the shape of what was being built between them, to the idea that a wolfless miller's daughter from a Copper River valley was exactly, precisely, entirely enough. He put the canvas back over his heart. He took her hand. The millstone turned in the current. The last of the evening light went out of the water and the first stars came through, cold and exact above the ridge. Epilogue. 1 year later. The saying was stitched into a new piece of canvas. Senna had done it herself, with better thread than the original, and hung in the study of the mill house that now served as both Aldrich's workshop and the administrative annex of the Crown's Thornmere water management project. A coin spends once, a good man spends a lifetime. The original scrap, grime-softened, letter-worn, had been framed by a Vorn court craftsman and hung in the king's private chambers, where Senna saw it every morning. She had made a small fuss about the framing being excessive, and then secretly appreciated it every day, which she considered a reasonable position. It was a late autumn morning, the river gone copper again, when Aldrich came to breakfast with more color in his face than he'd had in 2 years. His knee, treated by the valley physician who had finally been funded properly, had responded well enough that he'd been back on the mill roof last week. He had checked the shingle situation himself and found it acceptable. "The Eastern engineer is arriving tomorrow," Senna told him, spreading the morning's correspondence at the table. The flood channel design is finalized. Good. He sat down, accepted his tea. And you? How are you? She considered the question with the care she gave all of Aldrich's questions, because he asked them with the expectation of honesty. The past year had not been simple. Moving between Thornmere and the Vorn court meant navigating two worlds, both of which had initially preferred to see her as a category rather than a person. The wolfless girl in one, the miller's daughter in the other, as if those were complete descriptions. She had, with Cale beside her and her own stubbornness in front of her, spent 12 months declining both descriptions with increasing firmness. There had been difficult court evenings and difficult valley gossip, and one particularly memorable encounter with a countess who had referred to Senna's lack of wolf as a charming eccentricity, which Senna had addressed with a response so precise and calm that Cale had later told her it was the most terrifying thing he had witnessed in 10 years of governance. But there had been other things. There had been the water channel breaking ground in spring, the first Thornmere flood season in memory, that had not cut the grinding short. There had been the morning she had found Cale at the kitchen table with her father, both of them squinting at a gear design, arguing cheerfully about load tolerances, and had stood in the doorway feeling something she could only call completion. There had been the long evenings by the Vorn fire, where he read governance briefs, and she ran accounts, and they talked and didn't talk, in the comfortable rhythm of people who had decided to be present for each other's ordinary hours. And there was the coin. It was in her pocket still, had been every day for the last year, moved from coat to coat as the seasons changed. She touched it now without thinking, thumb running over the stamped profile. "I'm well," she told her father. Genuinely. He looked at her the way he had looked at her all her life, clearly, completely, as if she were a whole and sufficient thing. "I know," he said. "I can see it." She heard the door behind her, and knew without turning who it was by the particular quality of quiet that entered the room with him. Cale, who had ridden out before sunrise to check the engineer's advance camp, and was back early, still in his riding coat, reaching past her to steal a piece of bread from the table with the comfortable ease of a man who had learned where he belonged. "The channel markers are in place," he told Aldrich. "Your millstone's going to run year-round by next spring." Her father's face did a thing it rarely did, which was to show pleasure without reservation. Senna put her hand around the coin in her pocket, the small copper circle with its anonymous woman's profile, her mother's carried thing, her father's gift, her own kept truth. A year ago, she had moved it to her pocket because she hadn't known what was coming and had wanted something real to hold. She knew now. She let it go, warm in her palm, and reached instead for Cale's hand. A coin spends once. She looked at her father, at the framed canvas on the wall of his workshop, visible through the open door, at the man beside her who had spent every ordinary day of a year choosing to stay present. A good man spends a lifetime. Her mother, she thought, would have seen this clearly. So, at last, could she? End.